Hello, everyone. Welcome to Loop and Learn's open mic night. Tonight, once again, our special guest star and star of Loop of fame is Kenny Fox, and he's going to help you understand everything you ever wanted to know about ISF. No pressure, Kenny. The Loop app is a do-it-yourself closed loop algorithm. The presentation is provided to assist you in making your own decisions in consultation with your healthcare professionals regarding your own self-management of your own diabetes or your child's. You take full responsibility for building and running the system and do so at your own risk. And please remember that Loop app is not FDA approved for therapy. I think you all know that. Kenny, take it away. Teach everybody.
I don't know about everything you've ever wanted to know about ISF, but here we go. What we're going to focus on is how ISF impacts meals specifically. So we've touched on this in a previous video. It's a very confusing part of what people try to wrap their head around with the Loop algorithm. It took me a while to do that as well. Yeah, we're going to talk about what Loop does with the ISF with regard to meals. This is a little bit challenging to try and draw up. Visuals, I think, are important, but it took me a while to get the ones that I have. So we're going to work with what we have, and then hopefully we can improve on this in a future video. So this will help with questions and kind of the way I frame what we're going to talk about. So we talk about ISF as insulin sensitivity factor, right? That's how it's defined as. And what that really means is how much will given like a nice perfect basal and nothing, no negative impacts on your blood sugar in terms of stress or sickness or food, how much will that one unit bring you down over the course of that whole unit? And with Loop, we use a fairly realistic model of insulin duration. So about 6 hours that bolus will have some kind of impact. So again, you got to think about it as how far will you go over 6 hours, not the way a lot of people think about it as a correction factor, like, oh, I'm manually checking my PDM for some kind of recommendation because, blood sugar is high or something. That's often correcting something around food or stress or a bad site. We're talking about if you had bolus and just let it run the full 6 hours, how far would you go down? So that's true insulin sensitivity. So based on that information, what Loop's algorithm does is it will take that sensitivity and assume something about how carbs are going to impact your blood sugar. And the reason why this is important is you guys have seen the ICE screen. When you have a Loop app open, you can tap on the green graph at the bottom of the main Loop page, and you'll get a view of ICE, or insulin counteraction effect. Loop has said, okay, you've given insulin, but you haven't just gone down. You've gone up or stayed steady. You haven't gone down like the insulin should normally bring your blood sugar. So the counteraction effect, meaning not going down, is sort of what it's measuring. And it's doing that with the purpose of tracking carbohydrates, or how the meal has progressed that you've entered. And in the example here, that you can see on the left is the first one there is a quiche. It's 12 grams, and it says 2 grams absorbed. So what Loop is trying to do is it's tracking that meal and how it moves. That way, either, we've talked about before, you will time out, right? So at a certain point, it says, okay, I'm no longer waiting for carbs if I haven't seen them all. So that meal entry is over. Or if it sees all the carbs in that meal sooner than, or maybe at the right time that you entered, then it stops looking for carbs as well. So that reduces your active carbs listed on that green graph on the main Loop screen. So that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to help Loop track meals correctly. Now, it does this on a couple of ways. I can pull up the fancy mathematical algorithm, but I think you guys might go cross-eyed trying to look at it. But essentially, it has to do with carb ratio, like how much insulin you gave. But then the other part of that is insulin sensitivity, or how much blood sugar moved while you were eating, while there were active carbohydrates or while there was active insulin in your system. So let's talk about that for a minute. So let's talk about what Loop assumes with your insulin sensitivity. So these pictures are taken from one of the simulators that you can build in Xcode, but here you go. So this right here is an ISF of 50. And what you'll notice is this has 1 gram of carb. So I entered 1 gram of carb, and I said, okay, I'm not going to actually give insulin, but let's see what the prediction does. Let's see how the prediction moves. So you'll notice here at the top, it's pretty much all 100s flat, right? Obviously simulated. It doesn't normally happen. So I just told the system to give, a straight line 100 blood sugar for a while, for about an hour. and then I entered 1 gram of carb, and you can see what the prediction does. So with this ISF of 50, it goes from 100 to the eventual here is 105, right? So the difference is going from 100 to 105. So Loop is assuming that 1 gram of carbohydrate will raise your blood sugar 5 milligrams per deciliter with an ISF of 50. The next one, ISF of 100 in this picture. What's the difference? Anybody notice? Going from 100 to 110, it's 10 milligrams per deciliter. So with an ISF of 100, Loop assumes that 1 gram of carbohydrate will raise your blood sugar 10 points. Okay, and you can see the theme, right? We're gonna go to this one, and this one is 150. So this is 15 points at 150 ISF. And then this one is 200. So with an ISF of 200, so those of you with especially younger kids, kind of, probably like the 5, 6 and under sort of crowd, you'll have something like this, an ISF that's bigger, like 200 or more. So at 200 ISF, 1 gram of carbohydrate will raise your blood sugar 20 milligrams per deciliter. That's the assumption Loops makes, right? So that also means that if in the next few minutes, maybe 10 minutes from now, when that carb entry is actually active and looking for carbs, if blood sugar jumped 20 points from 100 to 120, it would say, I've seen all the carbs. I have seen 1 gram absorbed of the 1 gram you've entered. So now that entry is done. We're no longer looking for carbs. We now have 0 active carbohydrates. Down here at the bottom, it would say 0 active carbs. That's the basic idea, right? So blood sugar moves up a certain amount. 1 carb will take you up higher. And that kind of makes sense, right? If a little kid has 1 Skittle, their blood sugar is going to move up more than if a big kid or an adult has a Skittle. Does that make sense? Anybody have any questions about that? Anybody not tracking with the idea that 1 carb will do more to a little person than a big person?
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm having a hard time wrapping my head. You haven't given any insulin.
Nope.
So what does insulin sensitivity, how does that affect if you have, I think of insulin sensitivity, how much will it bring my blood sugar down?
Correct.
Not how does that affect when I'm just taking carbs without giving any insulin? I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. No, that's why I'm highlighting this is a challenging topic, right? Because we're taking what we think of insulin sensitivity, which is I give insulin and it moves my blood sugar down. But Loop also uses this to assume a certain amount of movement up from carbs based on that sensitivity.
If you were changing carb ratio at the same time you were fixing ISF, it wouldn't be exactly the same. It's the ratio of the ISF and the carb ratio that tells you how many milligrams per deciliter per carb. You may have a much bigger carb ratio for a little kid, so it's not just ISF.
But yeah, if you have a carb ratio that's different than 10 to 1, you won't get this exact same number. It won't be 5 points for every 50 ISF. It'll be a little bit different than that. So this does modulate based on your carb ratio as well. That adds an extra layer of complexity, but yeah. So Amy, does that sort of make sense? We're just trying to show that Loop does care about or assumes how your blood sugar is going to rise and how much it's going to rise if you weren't to give any insulin based on ISF.
Yeah, that helps. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. That's the main concept I want you guys to wrap your head around and the importance of that. Then once Loop sees your blood sugar moving up, or sometimes not even just not moving down, but mostly up, it will credit or count more carbs as being seen. So this might come into play if you were to enter carbs, or I should say this, forget to enter any carbs. Wait a while, your blood sugar goes up, and then you go backwards and you enter in the past when you had whatever it was, the juice or the cracker or whatever it is you ate, and you go backwards in time and add the carb entry in the past, then Loop will say, oh, okay, you had 10 grams of carbs entered. Now I've seen so many of them based on the rise. So I don't want to bolus for the carbs that are already done. I don't want to give too much insulin for those. So it will bolus for what's left in terms of carb ratio and the active carbs left, and then also correcting based on ISF. So it'd be a little bit less than if you dosed for the whole thing an hour later. You dosed for your whole meal because some of that impact's done and gone. Okay, so I did an entry similar to this. So I entered the carbs an hour ago. They happened an hour ago, and my blood glucose went up about 60 points, or 50 or 60 points right here, I think it was. you can see that with a 50 ISF and no insulin, or actually it's like a half unit, but I just gave the half unit. So assume basically no insulin here. It said the loop has seen 18 grams of carbs for this 10, right? So it's seen too many. You guys have probably seen this. This is a lot of you, I think Sarah posted not too long ago. And we talked about how you probably see a lot of these yellow, like too many carbs, more carbs than you entered being seen for these carb entries, and also then being high. So if you change, this is an ISF of 50 here, and that's what it's seen. If I take the same situation and change the ISF to, should be 100. Now loop has seen only 9 grams out of the 10, about an hour ago. So again, this is just changing the ISF from 50 to 100 for the same carb ratio, same blood sugar readings. How many carbs loop has seen in that hour has changed from 18 to 9. And if we raise the ISF again from 100 to 150, now loop has only seen 6 carbs. And then if we go all the way to 200, loop has only seen 5 carbs. So you see how by just changing the ISF, even though we haven't really bolused really much for this meal, you can now see that like the way loop counts the carbs for the meal and how many carbs it thinks are active or left to bolus for, or that will impact your blood sugar, changes just by changing the ISF. Now, if you change your carb ratio, the screen will change as well. But ISF even by itself has an impact on how this screen looks and how loop calculates active carbs from a meal. There's a lot to unpack here, but is there any question you have right here?
Yeah, I do.
Okay,
so
shoot.
in the first example, you showed 10 grams of carbs, but 18 were absorbed. And then you changed the ISF so it matched closely with 9 grams absorbed.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you know whether it was you didn't enter enough carbs or the insulin or the ISF was off?
Essentially, like you don't want to make big setting adjustments based on meals that you're not familiar with and probably can't count well, right? I'm not going to go out to a restaurant I've never been to and not really look up the nutrition facts and probably not even eat the whole thing and then just kind of guess and go, oh, now I need to change my settings because it didn't work out the way I wanted. In this case, we're going to assume a fairly predictable, maybe prepackaged, maybe weighed, maybe something you've had a bunch before and you're confident your carb ratio is already in good order. Then we're talking about ISF. What my general recommendation for people when trying to tune their ISF and trying to figure out what works best with loop during the day for meals is I find it easier to get your basal right and then carb ratio, because you can kind of test that open loop, even closed loop. As long as you're not like taking off and running away, you want to make sure there's enough insulin to counteract the food you're eating. But you can do a carb ratio test with a fairly simple meal, like a cracker or something more predictable that's relatively short and doesn't have a lot of fat and protein in it to kind of mess with your carb ratio, and do a quick test and make sure you're in the ballpark. Make sure you're not running away and you're not going super low. I think you can get those two first, and then you can figure out the ISF that works best and or an accurate ISF after you figure that out. Because there's 3 main settings, right? There's basal, carb ratio, and ISF. If you can figure out 2, you can figure out the other one typically. So if you get basal and carb ratio right, this is where I then just use ISF and I pick an ISF that's working best for most of my meals, because shifting 5 or 10 points either way is really hard to really test for and validate, and sensitivity can kind of change day to day. I find it's just easier to just pick an ISF after you have the other 2 figured out, after you're comfortable with enough insulin being given and basal being right, to then tweak with what works and makes not this 18 versus 10, but something more along the lines of something like this, right? This is a 4-hour meal, and in an hour, it's only seen half of it. That's probably more appropriate than seeing even 9, an hour into a 4-hour meal. So it's not like a specific answer to your question, but does that help, Amy? Give you a little bit of
it helps.
Parameters?
So
okay.
if it's matching after the 4 hours, if you're sure your carb count was right and this is matching, then probably your ISF is right too.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And if it's matching and you're happy with where you landed and there's not a whole lot of, you didn't end, that carbs didn't end super early, you're all good there. All right, let's talk about what this means for correction. So the red carbs on board that you guys saw on my graph just a minute ago, they were all ending like about an hour after the food was entered. Boom, 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 like really short. And so that's not good. There's not a whole lot that you're going to eat that really will expire in less than an hour. Maybe some juice, maybe some candy. There's really not a whole lot that should really be seen as absorbed in an hour or less. So if you're constantly seeing all your meals kind of ending fast, especially a Night Scout, because that's what I could see easily from Sarah's picture, that can actually leave. Sarah's daughter was actually ending up high all the time. And you might think, well, I've turned down the ISF, so it's more aggressive in its correction, so she shouldn't be high. And that's true, but to a point. This is 100 ISF, and keep in mind, this was the 9 grams absorbed. So it only thinks there's 1 carb left, right? So we took ISF from 50, which had 18 carbs absorbed after an hour, to 100, and now we have 9, so 1 more active carb. You'll see the recommendation is, when I check for a bolus here, recommendation with 100 ISF is only a 0.2 bolus, right? Well, you're like 165 and going up. That doesn't feel like a lot, right? So it went from 0.2. Then I bumped up ISF to 150 from 100. 4 more active carbs, right? So 6 out of 10 has been seen. So when I check for a bolus, it's 0.3. And I bet that probably feels backwards to a lot of you guys. You're thinking of ISF as correcting. But again, keeping in mind, we're trying to match up the reality of the carb situation to Loop, not thinking about ISF as a correction, right? Instead of correcting the meal, we want to make sure the meal is accurately represented. So going from 100 ISF to 150 ISF, getting weaker, I actually got a bigger bolus recommendation. Does that make sense? I went from 0.2 to 0.3, and then I'll drive that home a little more to go from 150 to 200. That gives us only 1 more carb, maybe like 1.5 more carbs left to absorb, and a higher sensitivity by quite a bit, 150 to 200. And the recommendation was even bigger, 0.4.
I mean, this is an example of the math going on with a fixed carb entry and a fixed carb ratio.
Yeah.
What happens if you change the ISF only?
Yes, correct.
Yes, because Loop is calculating that ratio of ISF divided by CR, which is kind of a hard thing to get your head in. But you're basically telling Loop the effect of the carbs you entered is changing by a factor of 1.5 or 2.
Yeah, exactly.
I assume you're not proposing this as a method for, I mean, I'm much more likely to go back and say, oh, well, I screwed up the carb entry and increase the number.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to clarify. This is understanding what's going on with the math.
So I want you guys to see how there's a relationship here where by increasing the ISF, making it more sensitive, you can sometimes get more of a bolus recommendation because there are more carbs active, and Loop kind of expects your blood sugar to go up a little higher, which is, I don't want you to lie to the system and pick an artificially high ISF, but I want people to understand that we get a lot of new loopers or even longer time loopers that are still coming in with this legacy idea of like manual pumping, where your doctor kind of gives you this correction factor to put into your PDM or your pump or whatever. And really that's used for, hey, I'm high, I'm going to actually look for a correction. And it's really what it is a correction number, not a sensitivity number. It's, here's a rough number to just go crazy with. Like, go ahead and give it, it's probably safe and it might fix your meal. Without you guys, now that you're looping, you can go, oh, I probably undercounted a meal. I can go back and I can fix that in Loop. I can go say, hey, I thought it was 20 grams. Now it's 30 because I forgot about this other thing I ate. And that changes the whole thing. On standard pumping and even all the commercial systems, you can't go back and fix what you told the pump. You kind of have to work with whatever you've been given. So it just, you have to correct. It's all you can really do, right? You can maybe mentally say, oh, I should give 10 more carbs worth of insulin, and you could enter 10 carbs into your pump. But even then, that's not traditionally what you're sort of told to do. So as a result of using correction factor, or sometimes they use ISF in the pump as really I just need to have some kind of idea how much to give when I mess up a meal, and not really insulin sensitivity. This is not that. We don't want Loop to be correcting. We want Loop to know about the meal instead, right? So what happens is, because you come from that paradigm, you bring a very low ISF that isn't really a very accurate ISF if you really to truly test it with, nothing on board, and you give a bolus and watch your blood sugar come down, for one. And two, that ends up resulting in a lot of times highs, because Loop is absorbing carbs too fast and wanting to give you about half as much insulin as maybe you would think you needed, right? So I want to drive that home. essentially you're coming in with, an ISF of maybe 30, 40, 50, and maybe it should be in the maybe 100 range, right? And that happens a lot with brand new loopers, or people seeing a lot of highs for, especially they're like kind of teens and they don't really want to bug them all the time to be correcting, and they're trying to figure everything out. I'll just bring the ISF down so Loop just gives more insulin, which will eventually work, but the initial result is not going to be fun. You're going to actually be giving less insulin.
Well, while Kenny's closing windows and getting himself back up to speed, I want to reemphasize what he just said. When you're coming from manual pumping, you're often doing one or maybe two corrections if you're high, and you can easily have a much lower ISF than is physically what's going on in your body because you do it one time. But Loop does it every 5 minutes. That's why it's important that you have a reasonable ISF, and it might not be the ISF that you're used to from manual pumping.
Marion, in the chat, someone asked, what's a typical, is there a conversion chart? While there is no conversion chart from correction factor to ISF, 2 to 4 times is typically what I see. I don't know what anybody else has observed.
2 to 4 times what you're kind of coming in with.
Yes.
Yeah.
It could be more,
yes.
it could be less, but it all depends where people are at. But that's what I typically see. It's a big difference.
So I have to say I'm a nerd. And when I was doing manual pumping, I actually did the thing where I did a unit and watched how much I dropped. I did the thing where I took a fixed amount of carb and watched how much it went up. And then I did the thing where I took the ratio and I said, oh, well, that means 1 gram of carbs raised my blood sugar by this amount. And that's been pretty consistent. So I came into Loop with a pretty good number. But those things should all be pretty consistent.
So you plugged it into the formula essentially, right?
Mm-hmm. You look at the units of things and look at the ratios. And so, ISF divided by carb ratio gives you milligram per deciliter per gram. And I said, hey,
close.
That's an interesting. And it turns out that physiologically, that's what's pretty consistent with people. But we're all used to, well, it's really, we're looking at the inverse of numbers that make sense.
Yeah.
So the way they set it up kind of odd in the first place, and we're stuck with it. I mean, I don't mean Loop set it up that way. I mean the medical people who came up with these formulas.
Right. Okay. So what I was saying earlier is there's this tipping point with ISF where you're going to come in likely with a fairly low ISF number, like Carol said, probably 2, even up to 4 times off, right? So if you're coming in with a 50, it might need to be 100 or 150, or probably not 200, but something like that. And that sounds crazy, but I've seen that, especially with kids, it's often that far off. And I'll tell you that if you come in with something like a 50, for example, there's another girl who was the same age as my daughter, running pretty similar numbers. Carb ratios were about the same, and basals were kind of about the same. Their ISF, they were just getting frustrated with not wrapping their heads around, entering fat and protein, and then really accepting the duration of insulin action. I know some of you guys get kind of frustrated by that and blame that as the reason why you're high. But in reality, what it was is the ISF was just too low. They couldn't bring themselves to bring it up to where we had it. We had it around 170 at the time, maybe 180. And they ended up bringing their number down to about 50 and had maybe 2/3 of their day was looking great because Loop was giving a lot of insulin. Carbs were absorbing super fast, but it was still able to correct hard enough later in the meal to help before the next meal. Otherwise, sometimes there was some lows though because of the overcorrection. Let me give you an example of this here. So I gave you examples of a 0.2 recommendation at 100, a 0.3 at 150, and a 0.4 at 200. But this same scenario with a 50 ISF resulted in a 1.2 unit correction. So there is a point where you bring your ISF down and Loop will be able to bolus hard enough against your meals to make a difference. But what is likely to happen more often than not, if you're not eating frequently, is at some point Loop will overcorrect because it will give too much insulin at a time when you don't have any food. This is that same scenario, I'll remind you, where we have 18 grams, the carbs are absorbed super fast, way too fast, 45 minutes for a 4-hour entry. And so Loop is going to correct, but it's correcting all based on the ISF and the momentum and all these other things. And it's giving a much bigger number. So there is that tipping point where going up in ISF will help give more insulin and more accurately represent your carbs oftentimes if your ISF is too low. And you could also try and bring it down to help correct, but you're going to have to, if your actual real ISF is something around 150 or 200, for example, you're going to have to get it down under 100 to really start to fight against those carbs and not leave you high, but you're also going to have more chances you're going to be low. I hope that makes sense. So coming in as a new looper, most people have their ISF too low because they're using the correction factor they were given or had kind of derived for themselves because they're constantly correcting after a meal rather than, remember in Loop, we're trying to make everything kind of let Loop know what's happening. So if there's still food affecting your blood sugar, Loop should know and have active carbs on board. If there's not, then it shouldn't take much insulin and your ISF should be set appropriately. So that's kind of the deal. Any other questions or topics you guys want to bring up? We have a few more minutes left. Hopefully you guys can appreciate the challenge of trying to explain this to you guys. Prepping for this.
Kenny, a question just came up. Does changing the ISF affect the length of insulin action? And the answer is no. No, it doesn't. It's 6+ hours regardless.
But what does it affect in terms of length? It affects the length of carb action, like how long or how slowly carbs are seen as absorbed. So, and since most people are dealing with highs around food, that will make sure there's enough carbs or even more carbs active in Loop, so that Loop doesn't expect you to be dropping when you shouldn't be, if that makes sense. Most people want to blame the action time as why they're high because it's so much longer than what they're used to. But what they're used to isn't physiologically accurate, if that makes sense.
Another question was, could carb ratio be based on the be based on weight as a starting point?
I have no idea. Is anybody else on that?
I see more typically based on age, but not necessarily. And hormones, right? Once kids hit puberty, all hell breaks loose, folks.
So I don't know if it's accurate, but I do know that in LoopDev, they have a formula where they take your basal rate and use that to give you an estimate for what your carb ratio might be. I think I'm going to have to go and check and make sure I'm right about that, but I'm pretty sure and that may just be based on what people used in the JABE study. Some things are averages based on what they observed, and some things might have some more physiological underpinning.
I have a question.
All right.
You said if you make your ISF higher, does that mean weaker?
Yeah.
And did I hear you correctly say that if you make your ISF higher / weaker, it'll give you more insulin?
Yeah, what I was illustrating is when you're around meals.
Yeah.
Sometimes it will result in more insulin because Loop sees that there's still more carbs left to deal with that you'll need insulin for. If you raise the ISF, carb entries will absorb more slowly, so the carbs will decay slower. Another way to say it.
Okay.
And Loop's always trying to it's matching, roughly, like the active insulin you have with the active carbs left, and kind of according to your carb ratio, sort of trying to keep that together. So if you're 10-to-1 on your carb ratio, for example, and you have 10 carbs active, and you have about 1 unit active in Loop, it's usually pretty happy with whatever's happening, generally speaking. But if all of a sudden if you only have 5 carbs active and a whole unit active, it's like, oh, you have way too much insulin on board. So it's going to assume you're going low. But if that's not really true, if you actually still have 10 more carbs left to digest and process, then you need to make sure that's showing in Loop. And oftentimes what keeps that from being a reality in Loop is ISF is too low for some people. Like if you counted the carbs right and your carb ratio is good and your basal is good, then the ISF is that last thing you need to change to kind of get Loop seeing what's really happening, seeing how much food you have left to deal with, and that the insulin you have on board is properly matched or not, but hopefully properly matched to the food you have in your system. It's that balance, that tug of war, kind of balancing active insulin versus active carbs. That's what Loop's sort of mostly attempting to do for a meal.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, and Samantha wants to see the algorithm. The algorithm is actually sort of in LoopDocs. There's some formulas in there that I need to update because The code hasn't changed that much, but there are some updates in some of the modeling. But there is, if you go into you're going to show the page. Good.
I'll show the page. Here you go. It's under operate, and then glucose prediction under algorithm, and then glucose prediction. But you got to go down quite a ways, about halfway down the page, to the carbohydrate effect section here. Starts to talk about it. You get, again, linear carb absorption we're not really using, but it drives a basic point home, so it'd be good to read. Dynamic carb absorption is mostly what we're talking about here. It has to do with the insulin counteraction effect at a certain point in time, with the observed activity, meaning blood sugar movement, as well as the what's the IA? I don't remember. Insulin effect, I guess. Insulin activity. There it is. So that's kind of how the math is put together, and you can kind of see how the active carbs are calculated with this formula down here. And then it takes that math and combines it with how the time window works, and it picks how many active carbs it's going to show based on.
Thank you to Katie DeSimone for these pages. She got someone to help her with the graphics, and I have not touched it. So, and then someone reiterated my statement: ISF divided by carb ratio. That basically is the expected blood sugar change per gram, and it's doing that every 5 minutes. It's comparing how your blood sugar changed to what it expected the change to be, and that's where it's coming up with that ice screen.
On that point, just, I know we want to end, but so I use that number to figure out how many grams of carbs to have.
Exactly.
So if your blood sugar is 70 and you know that your ratio is 10, you need 2 grams to get up to 90. You got to figure COB and IOB, but use that number. It's really important.
And for anyone who used free APS, that was where the carb badge came from, was to figure, it calculated how many carbs you needed to avoid the low blood sugar.
Should make sure you're not underrepresenting your ISF, and that you're representing your fat and protein and carbs for your meal, like we've talked about in our other series. You can see it in the playlist on the YouTube channel around meal bolusing. And those two things together should really take care of the majority of your meals by and large.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Kenny.